Good morning and welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net and thanks for tuning in. We're going to continue our reading and discussion of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power, this morning, beginning with the last paragraph on page 654, if you're following along in your own copy of the book. We're going to continue to talk about these so-called ecumenical councils and counter-councils, that is, papal councils, and the wrestling, as it were, for power between the popes and the councils. Where does infallibility rest in the Roman Catholic Church? That's the question, the primary question that all of these councils had in view. Where does the infallibility in the Roman Catholic Church rest? Does it rest in the breast of the Pope, or does it rest with the general councils of the Church? And if my listeners are studious and attentive, you must now have come to the conclusion that there is no infallibility in the Roman Catholic Church, either in the popes or in the councils, and that both are preoccupied with asserting to themselves earthly power and authority. The Roman Catholic Church is not the Church of Jesus Christ. It is a very, very, very clumsy counterfeit of the Church of Jesus Christ, and literally, as I suggested in a previous broadcast, several previous broadcasts, as a matter of fact, that when listening to this book, you can clearly see that God has given all these examples in history as simply a way to expose the papacy and the Roman Catholic Church and all of its councils for what it is. A very, very, very clumsy counterfeit of the true body of Christ. That's certainly the conclusion that I've come to, and I hope my listeners agree. But nonetheless, we'll begin now in the last paragraph on page 654. It says, Pope Nicholas V was elected Pope by those who espoused the cause of Pope Eugenius. Being of a meek and peaceful temper, he agreed to the suggestion of the princes with a view to compromise. Remember, there was this war was battling back and forth between councils, between the popes and the councils over the papal primacy, and it resulted in a schism in the church. As a matter of fact, it resulted in several different popes reigning at the same time. And it made the Roman Catholic Church a laughingstock, particularly the papacy, a laughingstock. And we're talking about the Council of Constance and the Council of Florence and the Councils of Basel. And what an awkward situation this poses to be explained by the Roman Catholic Church that calls itself infallible. And here we have a pope who wants compromise. And it says the final result was such an accommodation of the difficulty upon the conditions that Felix should resign and be made chief cardinal, that all the excommunications and censures on both sides should be revoked, and that, quote, also the decrees, dispositions, and regulations they had made should be confirmed, unquote. This arrangement was carried into effect, and Pope Nicholas V issued a bull accordingly, approving the decrees of both the Council of Florence and that of Basel. What there was in all these proceedings indicating the presence of what there was in all these proceedings indicating the presence and special direction of the Holy Spirit, it would be hard to find. The conduct of Pope Eugenius was characterized by violence, passion, malevolence, and perfidy, an entire absence of Christian charity and love. And if he had lived, the schism would, in all probability, have inflicted still greater injury upon the church. But it was healed for the time being by the pacific temper of Pope Nicholas V, and comparative quiet was restored. The Roman Catholic Church rejects the Council of Basel and accepts that of Florence as ecumenical. The latter manifestly has no just claim to that character, or certainly less claim to it than the former, which undoubtedly represented a majority of the Latin Christians. It has been suffered to acquire this character, however, because the popes and those passively obedient to them have been permitted to make up the history of the Church, and they, favoring their own infallibility and desirous of the power it gives them, have rejected the Council of Basel, which really represented the universal Church and the sentiments of the Christian world far more than did the papal faction at Ferrara and Florence. The assembly at Florence could not be called ecumenical in any proper sense, because there was nothing to show that it represented the universal Church. That at Basel was ecumenical for a time, at all events, even according to the papal rule. When Pope Eugenius solicited delay in its proceedings and agreed in consideration of its being granted that he would sustain its actions and approve its decrees, he knew that the decree declaring the council above the Pope had been passed. He must be understood, therefore, as having by this act made that decree a part of the law of the Church, according to the recognized forms of procedure. True, he supposed he could change it, and resorted to falsehood and intrigue to do so. But having failed in this, the only course left him was to assemble a seceding faction of his own, entice the Greeks to join it, cause it to enact a new decree, and then employ all the authority of the papacy to bring the Church to accept it as an ecumenical council. Even this, however, does not help the supporters of the Pope's infallibility out of the difficulty, for Pope Nicholas V afterward approved the decrees of the Council of Basel, which according to their theory makes them a necessary part of the faith, whether the council enacting them was ecumenical or not. But he also approved those of Florence, which of course had been also approved previously by Pope Eugenius. What then? There's but one common sense view of it. If Florence decreed in favor of the Pope's infallibility, and Eugenius approved it, Basil decreed against it, and Nicholas approved that, were they both infallible? If so, then the act of one was what the lawyers would call a set-off against that of the other. If neither was infallible, which I assert, by the way, if neither was infallible, then the act of Nicholas, being the last in point of time, must have held to be of more weight than that of Eugenius, or else Nicholas must be put in the singular attitude of having approved two decrees directly in conflict with the other. This would certainly require infallibility, though the integrity of such an act might well be questioned. But if it be conceded that the Council of Florence was ecumenical, and that it did regularly enact a decree in reference to the primacy of the Pope, as the advocates of papal infallibility now insist, we are brought to the point of inquiring to what degree, in point of fact, was let me read this again. But if it be conceded that the Council of Florence was ecumenical, and that it did regularly enact a decree in reference to the primacy of the Pope, as the advocates of papal infallibility now insist, we are brought to the point of inquiring what that decree in point of fact was, whether it went to the extent whether it went to the extent inserted or asserted or stopped short of it. If the reader will keep in mind the circumstances already detailed explaining the difficulty the Pope encountered in bringing the Greeks in to enter into the treaty in reference to his primacy, it will materially aid him in satisfactorily interpreting what follows. The Jesuits regard what they call the Decree of the Council of Florence as furnishing one of the strongest arguments in favor of their theory of infallibility. And Wenninger, remember the untruthful historian that we've been referencing occasionally here so far, and Wenninger, true to their cause, gives the whole of it in these words, quote, "We define that the Apostolic See, that is, the Roman Pontiff, has the right of primacy over all the churches of the world, that the Roman Pontiff is the successor of St. Peter, that he is the very vicar of Christ, the head of the whole church, the father and teacher of all the faithful, that in the person of Peter he was entrusted by our Lord with full power to feed, direct, and govern the whole flock of Christ. Such is manifestly the doctrine taught by the acts of the general councils as well as by the sacred canons." Unquote. Pretty heady stuff, right? Wenninger's book is so full of errors and misquotations as to excite suspicion against the integrity of much that he has said. And where we find him differing with such an author as Dupin, if the question rested alone between them, the preference should be given to the latter, to Dupin. There's no difficulty about that part of the decree which precedes the power to feed, etc. Dupin makes it confer the primacy with, quote, "power to feed, to rule, and govern the Catholic Church as it is explained in the Acts of Ecumenical Councils and in the Holy Canons," unquote, thus confining it within the limitations prescribed by the latter. But Wenninger goes further and represents the decree as conceding the primacy as an independent and substantive power with no limitations whatever upon it. And then, beginning with the new sentence, makes it declare that, quote, "Such is manifestly the doctrine taught by the acts of the general councils as well as by the sacred canons," unquote. This rendering of the decree is false at the very point upon which its whole meaning turns. The decree is in a single sentence, as the Latin in the last note will show. And it gives this decree in the Latin form, and I won't attempt to read it because I would butcher it and nobody would understand it anyway. But nonetheless, Dupin has taken it upon himself to change this decree, to give it a different flavor. He used deception. And this is the accusation of our author, R.W. Thompson. He says the decree is in a single sentence, as the Latin in the last note will show. To be understood correctly, all its parts must be taken together, not detached. But Wenninger very deliberately divides it into two sentences. He takes out the comma after the words, quote, "traditum es," unquote, in the original, and substitutes a period for it, thus closing the sentence. And then he translates the remainder, "quemodum etiam," unquote, etc., so as to make it mean, independently of what had preceded, that the same degree of primacy which the first sentence conceded was conferred by the councils and the canons. A schoolboy ought to detect this false translation, as almost anyone would with the original before him. The words quamid modum iteum, unquote, mean, quote, as also, unquote, and cannot be tortured into such a meaning as Wenninger has given them. Retaining the comma, then, in its proper place and leaving the decree one continuous sentence, as it is in fact, the last clause would be rendered, quote, as also is contained in the acts of the ecumenical councils and the sacred canons, unquote, making the two clauses dependent upon each other and the last referring to and qualifying what precedes it. This meaning is equivalent to that given by Dupin, quote, as it is explained in the acts of the ecumenical councils and in the holy canons, unquote, and substantially like that given by Milman, another historian, quote, according to the canons of the church, unquote. The true meaning, undoubtedly, is this, that the power and primacy of the Pope exist just in that decree which is expressed by the councils and in the canons. To have declared the Pope infallible, and to have followed it up with the assertion that he was also so declared by the councils and in the canons, would have been false in point of fact, for the very last preceding ecumenical council had decreed precisely the reverse, and there was no existing canon to that effect outside, quote, the constitutions, unquote, of the popes themselves. In other words, their briefs and encyclicals and bulls. And besides, the Greeks, who were jealous of Rome, would manifestly not have agreed to a treaty of union with the Latin Church if it had been understood that they thereby surrendered their independence within their accustomed jurisdiction and subjected themselves entirely to the dominion of an infallible pope at Rome. Now, at this point, I hope not to cause my listeners to stumble in their concentration, but I want to focus on this sentence right here. And when I read this, I want you to compare what R.W. Thompson would say about Vatican Council II and the ecumenical movement to reunite the Protestants with the Roman Catholic Church in 1965. Listen to what he says about the Greeks. And he says, and besides, the Greeks, who were jealous of Rome, would manifestly not have agreed to a treaty of union with the Latin Church if it had been understood that they thereby surrendered their independence within their accustomed jurisdiction and subjected themselves entirely to the dominion of an infallible pope at Rome. The Greeks had some wisdom back then. They knew that if they got into any kind of agreement with the Roman Catholic Church, that the Pope would use that as a pretense to take over the church and to bind them to obedience to the Pope. Now, do you see the importance of this in the case of Vatican Council II? What agreements did the so-called Protestant, or more correctly, ecumenical evangelibelly churches get into when they started negotiations with the Pope at Vatican Council II? What have they given away? They've given up their sovereignty. They've given up their liberty. They've given up their Christ. And they've bound themselves to Antichrist. Look, the Greeks were smart enough to realize you can't make a pact with Rome. You can't get into bed with the whore of Revelation chapter 17 because she will own you. And they were not going to give up their independence. They were not going to give up their sovereignty. They were not going to give up their church and surrender to Rome. I mean, it would have been extremely dangerous for the Greeks to concede anything to the papacy. But what did the Protestants do in America? What did the ecumenical evangelibellies do at Vatican Council II? They literally subjected themselves to papal authority. And little by little, the Pope is not going to be constrained. He's going to eventually control those churches, and if he has to, he'll do it through the government of the United States. Because the government of the United States must serve the church. And we're going to see more and more the churches of this country, Protestant and Catholic, become militant. And I expect before long, if Barack Obama has his way in making the private ownership of guns among the citizenry of this country illegal, these churches, in reciprocation for the favors that they've gotten from the government, will open themselves up for gun collection stations. And the guns of this nation will be delivered to the churches and picked up by the civil power and destroyed. That's what you get with Vatican Council II and getting in bed with the whore of Rome. You give up your sovereignty, you give up your security, and you get another master who will not accept that you serve two masters, but one. And that's the Pope of Rome. The Greeks were smart enough not to sign a treaty of union with the Roman Catholic Church. That cannot be said about the American Protestant or ecumenical evangelibelly churches. They went whole hog. And now they're unclean. Now, continuing, it says, construing the treaty in the light of the actual relations then existing between the two churches, that is, the Roman Church and the Greek Church, it must be understood that the Greeks intended to concede nothing more than they had conceded at the First Council of Constantinople. That is, that the Roman Catholic Church had the primacy of honor, and nothing more, except such authority as had been from time to time granted by the councils of the canons. I would go one final step further. I would simply denounce the Roman Catholic Church as Antichrist, just as all the Protestant reformers did. And I would render any agreements, any contracts, any concordats, any other binding, either expressed or implied, as null and void. And I would leave Rome to her own devices. And if I had to, I would draw arms to defend myself against her usurpations and tyranny, just like the Protestant reformers did. We'll be back right after these messages.
Years ahead of the dominant media, FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
The book of Revelation says, "The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ." This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Papacy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Papacy Reality News app installed today, so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Papacy Reality News app. Get it now.
Welcome back to the broadcast. Remember, the second half of Inquisition Update, just like the first half, is brought to you by FirstAmendmentRadio.com. So if you like Inquisition Update and would like to hear it continue on First Amendment Radio, please support FirstAmendmentRadio.com. And for my part, please be on your knees in prayer. Remember me in your prayers. That's all I ask. Now, continuing with the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson, he says, during the remainder of the 15th century, after the proceedings at Florence had ended, the popes were undisturbed both in the claim and in the exercise of authority, except as they brought themselves in contact with princes. But their efforts to have it accepted as universal were in no manner slackened. Under the influences exercised by them, the discipline of the Church had become so relaxed that in 1512 the Fifth Lateran Council was convened by Pope Julius II to provide in some effective mode for its reestablishment. Now, I would like to comment. Throughout all of this book, and up to 659 pages, R.W. Thompson has shown us repeatedly that every time the papacy gathers up more power, more control, more influence, the corruption in the Roman Catholic Church explodes. And they have to convene a council to bring discipline back to the church. And at this point, you can almost see it as a barometer of the power of the Pope and his influence by the corruption in the church and in the governments. It's a barometer. What is most apparent is the corruption in the government and in the church, just like we see today. Look at the corruption in our government. if you understand what 9/11 was and the Holy Roman Crusade that resulted from it, you can come to no other conclusion than that the corruption in our government is almost beyond articulation, beyond comprehension. And the pedophile priest pandemic in the world has become so effusive that it cannot even be denied by the mainstream media that is employed to protect the papacy and the Roman Catholic Church and the priests. It can't be ignored anymore. It's a global plague. Now, taking just those two, we don't have time to go into all the corruptions, but just taking those two, the Holy Roman Crusade that came out of the government-sponsored destruction that took place on 9/11, the false flag, Pearl Harbor, number 2, the American version of the burning of the Reichstag, wholly supported by our government, even to the degree that they assembled a phony commission to come up with some cockamamie story that some 19 towel-headed camel jockeys who couldn't fly Cessna 150s boarded multi-engine, heavy-bodied commercial jet airplanes in some of the most heavily secured airspace in this country and flew them around unhindered and undetected and knocked down the Twin Towers and flew a plane into the Pentagon in the most heavily defended airspace in this country, if not the world. You can't come to any other conclusion but that our government, at the very least, knew about it and let it happen. Now, my personal opinion is it was a government managed affair with cooperation with the Pentagon, the CIA, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Roman Catholic hierarchy in the White House and in New York City. That's corruption on a biblical scale. And so is the corruption of the priesthood of the Roman Catholic Church. At no time in Roman Catholic Church history has there been so much corruption in the priesthood. And so we simply can use, as R.W. Thompson has shown us repeatedly in this book, that corruption is the automatic result when the papacy gathers more and more and more power. The discipline of the church relaxes, and so does the discipline of the governments over which it rules. And we see corruption on an unspeakable level in our government and an unspeakable level among the priesthood, so you know how much control the papacy has over the United States of America. Now, some would just automatically say, well, that's pretty flimsy, Tom. Well, if you read and paid attention to this entire book, it's not flimsy at all. It's expected. When you see one, that is the corruption, you automatically can gauge the power that the papacy has over our government. He says, during the remainder of the 15th century, after the proceedings at Florence had ended, the popes were undisturbed, both in the claim and the exercise of authority, except as they brought themselves in contact with princes. But their efforts to have it accepted as universal were in no manner slackened. Under the influences exercised by them, the discipline of the church had become so relaxed that in 1512, at the Fifth Lateran Council, it was convened by Pope Julius II to provide in some effective mode for its reestablishment. And this brings us to the inquiry whether or not papal infallibility was so decreed by this council as to make it binding upon the whole church. This cannot be decided satisfactorily without understanding also the true character of that council and the circumstances which led to it. At the time of the Council of Basel, the French church occupied an anomalous position toward the papacy. realizing that the popes were endeavoring to encroach upon its ancient liberties, and that to concede to them superiority over general councils would enable them to do so, it moved with as much caution as possible, consistently with the preservative of its boasted independence. Therefore, the King of France, Charles VII, instead of giving an open adhesion to the Basilian decrees, favored a compromise of the disagreement between the two councils, Basel and Florence, rather than an open rupture. At the same time, he was unwilling to concede to the Pope his asserted supremacy. Finding, however, that both parties were driven to extremities, each anathematizing the other as schismatical and heretical, no other course remained to him but independent action. Accordingly, he assembled a national council at Bourges in 1438, by which was promulgated the, quote, pragmatic sanction of Bourges, unquote, which not only asserted the right of councils to legislate for the Church and to control the Pope by its canons, but went even further and insisted upon the authority of a National Council of France to legislate for the French Church. So what we're actually seeing here is the French Church trying to literally separate and become its own independent Roman Catholic Church, much like used to be here in the United States. Remember in our discussion of the book, The Ark and the Dove, Jesuit priest Archbishop John Carroll wrote a carefully worded letter to the Pope and told him these revolutionaries here in the colonies are not about to sit and tolerate any interference from any foreign potentate, whether it be the Crown of England or the Pope of Rome. Most of the Protestants, the pilgrims that came to this country, were fleeing papal persecution, and they were not about to let the Pope have any influence in this country. And so, Mr. Pope, if you are intent on appointing bishops for the Catholic Church in the colonies, you will excite those Protestant pilgrims to deeds of blood, and they will eradicate the 1% of the population of Roman Catholics in this country, and you'll lose any hope of ever having a Roman Catholic Church in this country. So you've got to back off. You've got to leave us alone and let us have our own American Roman Catholic Church, or we're not going to survive. And you're going to lose not only the United States, but you may well lose the entire Western Hemisphere, and your Christopher Columbus's discoveries will be lost. And this is what is taking place right now in this case that we're reading of the French Church. They assembled their own national council. They were going to set up some protections for the French Church as independence. And it says, thus, upon the vital question out of which the issue between the two rival councils had arisen, the French Catholics, it says Christians in the books, but we have to understand these are Catholics. The French Catholics took the sides of the Basilian Fathers, maintaining the decree of the Council of Constance. But from motive of expediency merely, they refused to recognize the deposition of Eugenius and rejected the claims of Felix V. These contradictory movements had their origin in state policy far more than in the necessities and interests of Christianity. You see, the motivation in Catholics is always from a temporal point of view, never from a spiritual. This defines the Roman Catholic Church. It's what separates it from the true body of Christ. Even these French Catholics who are refusing to put themselves under papal authority are setting themselves up to maintain their independence. They're more concerned about moral thing, about temporal things than they are about spiritual. And it says, these contradictory movements had their origin in state policy far more than in the necessities and interests of Christianity. These latter were of secondary consideration, both with the Pope and the King. The principal motive with each being the acquisition of temporal power. The Pope, of course, was deadly hostile to the quote-unquote pragmatic sanction, while the King was determined to maintain it. The former and his adherents insisted that by virtue of his supremacy, he had the power to revoke the authority of the Council of Basel, and that although it was ecumenical at the beginning, all its decrees passed subsequent to his act of revocation were void. On the other hand, the King claimed that the Pope's approval of his decrees previous to the calling of the Council of Ferrara made valid that which asserted the superiority of councils, and that as the council was assembled with the assent of the Pope, his sanction related to all the decrees passed by it during its entire session. And hence, as the pragmatic sanction was but a reaffirmation of the decree passed at Basel, therefore it also had the implied, if not the expressed, sanction of the Pope. The pragmatic sanction became the statute law of France by enactment of Parliament. It was fiercely denounced by several popes in the language of denunciation so familiar to them. But all their efforts to get it out of the way were unsuccessful during the reign of Charles VII. Under that of Louis XI, they were attended with better results so far as the papacy was concerned. This arbitrary monarch, influenced by both papal flattery and threats, revoked the sanction by an imperial decree, utterly disregarding the will of the French Christians and the dignity of France. Upon the question of his authority to do this, he and the Pope were fully agreed. Each maintained the quote-unquote divine right of kings and princes to rule without regard to the wishes of the people. But they disagreed upon another point. Louis supposed that the rescission of the sanction would give him the whole power, as king, to control the Church of France, whereas as soon as the act was consummated, the Pope claimed all this power for himself and so exercised it as to sow the seeds of corruption broadcast all over France and to cause both him and the king to be held in contempt by the French Christians. Parliament now interfered and declared the king's act of revocation illegal, which left the principles of the pragmatic sanction in force. Yet the restoration of papal authority consequent upon the conduct of the king had produced such results that the French church became paralyzed by the blow. This paralysis continued until the reign of Louis XII, who formally re-established the sanction. Julius II was then Pope and immediately assumed a hostile attitude toward the king. This led to remonstrances on the part of the French clergy, who insisted upon a general council to settle again the points of disagreement. To this, Pope Julius would not consent, fearing a repetition of the decrees of Constance and Basel. His refusal induced the King of France and the Emperor of Germany to take steps on their own responsibility to have a council convened. Having obtained the acquiescence of 9 cardinals, these latter called a council to meet at Pisa in 1511. The Pope now became both embarrassed and incensed, and like his predecessor Eugenius IV, immediately inaugurated measures to prevent, if possible, the reenactment of the decrees of the Council of Constance and Basel. The question, what was or was not the true faith, being of far less concern to him than the gratification of his own ambition. For this purpose he called a council at Rome, which would be more under his control than at Pisa, and summoned the prelates who had appointed the latter council to attend at his Palace of the Lateran in 1512. He threatened to degrade them of their dignity and deprive them of their benefices if they did not attend. Disregarding both his summonses and threats, they opened the council at Pisa, asserting their right to do it under the protection of the princes at whose instance they had acted independently of the Pope. It was attended by 4 cardinals in person, the procurators of 3 others, 2 archbishops, 13 bishops, 5 abbots, several doctors of law and divinity, and the deputies of the universities of France. This council renewed the decrees of the councils of Constance and Basel concerning the authority of councils over the Pope, and adjourned to meet at Milan, where they endeavored to have the Pope to meet with them in order to decide upon the necessary measures of reform. This he refused, and they at last proceeded to declare him contumacious and schismatic, and to suspend him from the administration of the papacy. The Council of Pisa then came to an end, and although it had not at any time any authority as an ecumenical council, and only serves to show how large a portion of the Christians of Europe refused to admit the supremacy claimed by the Pope, yet its decree suspending the Pope was accepted in France, where the King Louis XII forbid his subjects any longer to regard Julius II as Pope or to pay any attention to his bulls. The Pope replied by excommunicating the king, putting France under an interdict, and releasing his subjects from their oath of allegiance. And thus the contest between these royal representatives of the divine right waxed to an exceeding degree of warmth. The council called by Julius II, the 5th Lateran, met in Rome in 1512. It was certainly not ecumenical at the beginning, having no juster claim to be so considered than the assemblage at Pisa, unless the Pope's claim of supremacy is primarily conceded. The word ecumenical has but one meaning, that of universal. Ecumenical councils are designed to give expression to the universal faith, and therefore, in all the early ages of the Church, they constituted, quote, the highest courts of juridicature in all dogmatic discussions, unquote. But they obtained that character only by virtue of the fact that they represented the entire Church, that is, included in all the episcopate. If they did not do this, they had no jurisdiction over matters pertaining to the universal Church, or in other words, could not decide questions of faith. Measured by this rule, the 5th Council of the Lateran was certainly not ecumenical at its commencement, because the whole Church was not represented there. There were no prelates from England, France, Germany, Spain, Austria, Bohemia, Poland, Hungary, or any other part of the so-called Christian world outside of Italy, and only those who lived alone upon the favor and the patronage of the Pope. So the Pope's got his own little entourage to set up this council. He's going to operate completely independently of the rest of the Roman Catholic Church. And it says, Dupin says they were, quote, all Italians, unquote, except some abbots. Thus far, then, it was entirely factious, like that at Ferrara, both factions having their origin in precisely the same motive, power. Did it afterward become ecumenical? Its original character was not changed during the life of Julius II, although within that time it had declared annulled all the proceedings at Pisa, confirmed the bull against the King of France, and fiercely attacked the Pragmatic Sanction. It had also summoned all its supporters to appear and show cause why it should not be revoked. At this point, the death of Julius II occurred, and Pope Leo X became pope. Being of the princely family of de' Medici of Florence, he entertained more enlarged views than Julius II, and the King of France was encouraged by hopes of a satisfactory reconciliation with him. Accordingly, he sent his ambassadors to the council and renounced the proceedings at Pisa. The King of Spain and the Emperor of Germany did the same, and the prelates who had assembled at Pisa also attended the council. The French bishops had not yet done so. The king stipulated that they should, but the time was postponed till the latter part of the year 1516, when the council was to hold its 11th session. Before that time arrived, Louis XII died, and Francis I became the King of France. With him and the Pope, the question now became one of diplomacy, the interest of the Church still remaining secondary. A diplomatic ambassador was sent to Rome and finally came to a compromise with Pope Leo X by abrogating the Pragmatic Sanction and substituting the celebrated Concordat of Bologna in its place. Each of the parties to this arrangement supposed himself the gainer. The king by being made head of the Church of France, and the Pope by being enabled to collect annats and imposts in France, which had been denied by the Pragmatic Sanction. It was all about power. Had nothing to do with Christianity whatsoever. How corrupt is the papacy and the kings over whom he rules? That's the definition of Roman Catholicism. It is not the Church of Jesus Christ. It is the Church of Antichrist, and God, through history, has made a folly of it. We'll be back to discuss it tomorrow on the program. Thanks for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.